Today we're going to talk about the election results, as you know, and some very interesting results for those people who were expecting a red wave, and that was really the main expectation that was generated. There wasn't a red wave, and people are coming up with cute alternative ways of describing what did happen. But let's, without getting into labels, we can get into the specifics. First of all, to start out with Wisconsin, and many of you know this, but we'll get into the details rather than the overall sometimes. Tony Evers was reelected as governor, and that, of course, was considered to be a major development because the alternative would have been to have a Republican-dominated legislature and a Republican governor. And so whatever the legislature did would become signed into law. The legislature did not get a veto-proof majority. So Tony Evers does have, as he did during his first 4 years, the veto power to block any kind of legislation that he regarded as either silly or dangerous. Ron Johnson was reelected as a senator, so he'll serve for another 6 years. And Josh Kaul was elected as attorney general. The treasurer that got elected was a Republican. So we didn't have a kind of just people voting just Democrat or just Republican. We'll get into that in a bit and talk about this. It's not the same kind of split vote that we have had historically, but we did have Republicans and Democrats that won election. Doug LaFollette, there may be a recount here, but he kind of squeaked in for another term as Secretary of State, and should point out that Secretary of State in Wisconsin has had, that office has been really diminished in terms of its authority and its importance. And in a sense, Doug LaFollette kind of ran saying, let's continue that, because the alternative was to do what a lot of other states are doing, that is elect a Secretary of State who has a pretty considerable control over the administration of elections, including certifying the results of elections. And of course, with the Trump stop the steal and the denying of Joe Biden's win, that is significant. That was not an issue in Wisconsin. The laws would have had to be changed. But in any case, Doug LaFollette is still Secretary of State, barring a recount that overturns that. Wisconsin has sent 2 Democrats and 6 Republicans to the United States Congress, and that represents 1 less Democrat. The representative from the western part of the state, generally the La Crosse area, traditionally or for quite some time, has been a Democrat, but the Republicans were able to flip that, and Van Orden was the winner there. In the state assembly, 35 Democrats and 64 Republicans. That's the total. Of course, all members of the assembly run at the same time. They don't have the longer terms or overlapping terms like the Senate. In the Senate, we elect 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years. And the results of the 2022 elections is that 5 Democrats were elected. So they have a total now of 11, and 12 Republicans. So they have a total of 22. In other words, the state Senate does have the capacity to get the 2/3 majority to override a veto, but that's not sufficient. You have to have 2/3 of the Senate and the Assembly, and the Republicans are a couple short in the Assembly. I might note, and we can get back to this a little bit later, that even though the Republican victories in terms of Senate and Assembly seats and U.S. House of Representatives is pretty lopsided. It doesn't reflect the votes that we see for the statewide offices, such as governor, U.S. senator, attorney general, etc. And if you take all of the votes that were cast for legislators in the state of Wisconsin, 53.9% of them went for Democrats. But that doesn't get reflected in terms of the results and who's got what proportion of seats. That is a description, of course, of gerrymandering. If we take a look at the number of votes cast, we get a little bit of explanation, particularly for the Republican victory in the treasurer race. As you can see, the governor, more people voted for governor than for any of the offices, 2,648,000. U.S. Senate was relatively close behind, but then when you get to Attorney General, Secretary of State, that gets diminished. And for treasurer, that is the least. So again, we don't have people doing straight party line voting. We don't even have people voting for all of the offices. Some people are obviously deciding that they're just going to vote for one office like governor and not the other offices, or they're going to vote for some offices and not others. And not surprisingly, that really has an impact. If we take a look at the demographics of Wisconsin, as of August, this is the breakdown. You can see we have those of us who are in an age category where we are older and wiser and experienced. We dominate. 940,000 people from 50 to 64, and those of us, the cream of the crop, over 65, 976,000. I think it's always interesting to look at the young people who are just getting registered, people who are just getting involved in politics. That is going up every year. And it's interesting that the exit polling that has been done indicates that that is a age group that leans Democratic by 13 points currently, which explains the concern that some Republicans have about young people voting and wanting to make sure that we don't have too many young people voting, and some of the voter suppression efforts that have been made. I should point out, and this is true in this next slide too, especially important here, that these numbers don't fully capture a phenomenon that those of us who worked at the polls certainly saw, and we see this every time, and that is they don't really reflect the new registrants. These are based, the registration numbers are really, as I pointed out in the previous slide, those are last August or this past August. A lot of people voted, registered to vote. The Wisconsin Election Commission has not revealed yet the total numbers, so we don't have that. But as of August, there were 3.5 million registered voters. In 2022, a little over 2 million did vote. So that's a pretty good number, but 1.5 million short, so a pretty bad number. It's a pretty good number in terms of midterm elections. We tend to get a lot more people voting for presidential elections than we do midterm. And if you do the calculation of the percentage of people who turned out to vote and actually voted, as opposed to those who were registered, that's in 2022, this past election was 56.7%, down from the previous midterm election in 2018, but relatively good compared to other states, relatively good in contrast with the historical pattern in Wisconsin. This was our second highest turnout. And take a look at Dane County, huh? 80%. Again, you can take a look at, is the glass half full or half empty. 20% of the registered voters. I'm talking about registered voters now, not eligible voters. So there still are more people who are eligible to register and vote that could be mobilized. And Dane County is, as I'm sure we all know, increasing in population. And that gets reflected in the voting totals as well. There were 6,000 more votes cast in Dane County overall this election than 4 years ago. When we contrast that with Milwaukee, it's quite a contrast. In Milwaukee County, there were 46,000 fewer people who voted. In the city of Milwaukee, 36,000 fewer. And if you take those numbers and look at the margins in which the victors of the gubernatorial and senatorial races had, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that, well, turnout really matters. And if turnout had been higher in Milwaukee, probably the Democratic candidates would have done better. The real puzzle, I think, at least for me, was that there was an expectation that Mandela Barnes would really just being on the ticket, that his presence would generate a pretty high turnout. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen on a percentage basis, and it didn't happen in terms of the number of votes that were cast in Milwaukee. And that had an impact for him, and mainly for him, because he was the one who lost, but also for Aaron Richardson, who lost the treasurer race as well. If we take a look at general trends in Wisconsin and compare votes, how they came in, where they came from, the Republicans went up. They got higher percentage, not always a higher number of votes, but higher percentages in small towns and rural areas. And the Democrats continued to be up in urban areas, suburban, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, last few elections. The Milwaukee suburbs in particular have seen more support for Democrats, and in the Fox Valley, Green Bay area, Appleton, Door County in particular. Door County actually did go for Tony Evers and Mandela Barnes. The other areas that traditionally go for Democrats that still have small towns and rural areas, and I should point out, are the area around Superior, the northwestern part of the state, and generally a lot of the communities that have University of Wisconsin campuses, Eau Claire, La Crosse. Those are areas that a majority have supported Democrats, and that pattern continued this time around too. But it's a lot of people call Wisconsin a purple state, a divided state, and it is. But it should be noted that the divisions are very much along where people are living. Not entirely, but that's a major explanation for the divisions. And this again raises the issue of gerrymandering. If the districts were drawn in a way that reflected the inclinations of the voters on a statewide basis, we clearly would have a much more competitive situation in the state legislature and among the congressional races than we do. But those boundaries were consciously written explicitly. The Republican legislators make no bones about it. They wanted to secure and maintain power by drawing those boundaries in a way that would split Democratic areas as much as possible and advantage the Republican areas. So it's you've heard of the whole term of packing. They draw the boundaries that you pack Democrats into as few districts as you possibly can, so that they may get a lot of votes, but those votes are not going to translate into a lot of victories on a district by district basis. So that's the gerrymandering issue that's occurred and becomes a kind of general concern that we've now encountered for the last couple of decades. Wisconsin's districts were not always drawn with a partisan agenda fully in mind. Something I guess is, I didn't put down the statistics in terms of showing a trend, but something that occurred this past election that seems to be occurring pretty consistently and pretty frequently now is the approval of referenda. This time around, there was $1.4 billion around the state in school districts, and these are all really school-driven referenda for capital expenditures, that is buildings, either remodelings, new buildings, new schools, and the like. And $300 million in operational. The operational is, as the term implies, it's not for building something, but it's for paying salaries and keeping the lights on and the buildings heated and all the rest of it. The state has levy limits. It has limits that it has put on school districts for going above certain levels of property tax revenue to pay for operational costs. And there is a provision that says that voters in a school district can exceed those limits if they approve it in a referendum. So they've got to explicitly approve it in that way. So not all of the referenda did get approved. There were some that failed. Most notably, a big capital referenda in La Crosse went down. But generally, these referenda have been approved. The voters in the various school districts obviously value education and recognize that since the state is not going to pay that locally, you have to pay for these expenses. Locally, Middleton has been, last couple of elections, they've approved some pretty sizable referenda. We take a look nationally, and we still have dynamics going on there, but beginning, before the election, as you know, Republicans and Democrats had even number in the United States Senate. Thus, it was important to have Vice President Kamala Harris there to break the tie, and so the Democrats were advantaged. At this point in time, the Democrats continue to have 50 U.S. senators, and the Republicans have 49. So one scenario is, well, there's a runoff in Georgia. Georgia has a state law that says that you have to have over 50% of the votes in order to win a U.S. Senate election. And that didn't happen. Ralph Warnock, the incumbent, got 49.4%, and Herschel Walker got 48.5%. So if Georgia were another state, Ralph Warnock would have won, and the Democrats would have 51 seats. They still might get 51 seats if Warnock wins, but it'll depend on the runoff. And that is consequential for a variety of reasons. And Joe Manchin is probably especially interested in the election in Georgia, since it would, if there were 51 Democrats, it would take away his the opportunities that he has taken advantage of to leverage his vote for the Democrats passing legislation that is posed by the Republicans on a kind of a party basis. Not all legislation is party, one party versus another, but a lot of the major legislation is. In the U.S. House of Representatives, they're still counting votes. And it looks like it's a done deal that the Republicans are going to have control of the House of Representatives. You need 218 votes in order to have the majority in the House of Representatives, or 435 seats. And at this point, there are 216 races have been won by the Republicans, 211 by the Democrats, and 8 are undecided. So the Republican majority, which is almost inevitable, to be realistic, is going to be pretty slim. It not only single digits, but less than 10. And that inevitably is going to have implications. And we can talk more about that when we get into our discussion time. Number of notable developments that are somewhat random, but obviously important because I've got them here on the slide, right? One is we've got a record number of women governors in the United States, 9, and major development in terms of diversity of candidates. The 714 LGBTQ candidates around the country, and these include state legislatures, U.S. Congress, et cetera. And 453 of the 714 candidates won. And there were victories in all 50 of the states. That's a major threshold in terms of seeing a diverse representation by in our legislature. Another issue is election deniers. First of all, the numbers, 211 election deniers won. And again, like with the other, like with the 714 number, 211 includes state legislative races, House of Representatives, U.S. senators, governors, etc. And if you take a look at the House of Representatives, 1/3 of the newly elected representatives are election deniers. 16 total of the U.S. Senate are election deniers. And by election denier, I just pause and make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who are saying that Joe Biden did not fairly win the election in 2020. And they have not committed to accepting the results of elections. They're sort of saying, well, maybe so, maybe not. We'll see. And they include their own election as well as the elections of others. We now have 10 governors, 7 attorney generals, 6 secretaries of state who are election deniers. It's a considerable number, and we've never had those kinds of numbers at all. The numbers are pretty breathtaking. Secretaries of state, as I mentioned earlier, except for Wisconsin, they administer elections. So that's a pretty powerful office in most states. So that's pretty important. However, the only one who's really been very adamant about this has been the Secretary of State in Indiana. And he is somebody who's tied up in a lot of scandals right now and doesn't have a lot of clout in Indiana and the like. So he's an election denier. What he would do, we're not really sure. But we had in Arizona, New Mexico, Minnesota, number of Nevada, a number of people who were really very, very visible, very, very vocal candidates as secretaries of state, and they did not win. And one of and a lot of the governors, like the governor of Pennsylvania, the Republican candidate there, was clear that he didn't accept the 2020 election, and he would exercise his discretion in whether to certify future elections, but he lost. So the most visible ones have lost, and that's an important kind of message and an important kind of development. So far, we haven't had anything like we had with the presidential election 2 years ago, with people who lost the election saying that the election was stolen. They haven't all conceded, but we'll have to wait and see. It may be that we've got more election deniers than we have people denying the election. If we can make that kind of a distinction. So that's something that we'll have to kind of watch and see how it develops. But generally, the message around the country, and specifically in some states where it was a major issue, is that democracy is important, and when an election is over, we ought to respect the results of the voters of the election. Reproductive rights got a lot of support around the country in a general way and specifics. And here we've got a situation where, for example, in Kentucky and Michigan, they passed a statewide referendum amending their constitution so that reproductive rights were enshrined in the Constitution. In Kentucky, it was done in a kind of backdoor or backwards kind of way, but it was done. We've got a lot of the governors that won, as opposed to those that lost, who are supportive of reproductive rights, including in Wisconsin. So generally, people really said to the U.S. Supreme Court that they made a decision that is not at all supported by the general public and the electorate. Gerrymandering, mentioned it in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has really been an example of gerrymandering. The extent to which there's gerrymandering in Wisconsin is really absolutely incredible. Florida is now approaching that, and the Florida gerrymandering, which is just recent, was done in an unusual way, where Governor DeSantis actually took a map that was designed by the Florida legislature that clearly favored Republicans, and he himself then redrew it and said, we can go one better. That was a very unusual for a governor to play that kind of role, Florida elsewhere. And they went ahead with what DeSantis wanted. So there's gerrymandering in Florida, kind of consolidating Republican power in the legislature and the state there. Michigan is an example of the opposite. For almost 30 years, Michigan has been gerrymandered, where, again, if you take the statewide votes, kind of like what we did earlier today with Wisconsin, statewide votes indicate the level of support for the Democrats that does not get reflected in Democratic controlled House and Senate seats in their state legislature. Michigan, a couple of years ago, established and they did this through statewide referenda. They established a bipartisan or nonpartisan, I should say, commission to draw the boundaries rather than letting the legislature do it. And Michigan, largely as a result of that, Michigan, for the first time in almost 35 years, has a Democratic-controlled legislature, Democratic-controlled governor's office. The other races on a statewide level, Democrats won there as well. So Democrats are feeling very good about developments in Michigan. And their governor, I think, almost inevitably has to be considered as a potential candidate for president, given a number of other dynamics that might happen. State Supreme Courts, those are obviously important. And anyone who's been following developments in Wisconsin certainly understands that. Republicans made gains in Ohio and North Carolina. They had, and they have partisan races, explicitly partisan races for their state Supreme Courts. And Democrats have been in the majority in the state Supreme Courts in those two states. North Carolina has been particularly interesting because they've had some attempts at gerrymandering in that state that their state Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional. And that case actually went before the US Supreme Court. So the change from Democrat majority to Republican majority in those two states is likely to have some major implications. In contrast, the Democrats are progressives. Again, these are in partisan races that we've just had. In Michigan, Kentucky, Kansas, Arkansas, and Montana have either thwarted Republican efforts or outright been gains, significant gains for Democrats, or in cases where they're not partisan, as partisan in terms of labels, the progressives have won. Wisconsin, as you probably know, has a nonpartisan race, at least it's supposed to be nonpartisan. That's more fiction than fact. Everybody knows who the Republican and who the Democratic candidates are, at least who the party loyalists are supporting as candidates. We have a very, very important state Supreme Court race coming up this spring. Trump endorsements, mentioned when we first got together this fall, that Trump was really trying through the primary process and endorsing people in the primary to reward and to punish people and establish a position as a boss through the primaries, a kind of real turn from the historic original idea of having primaries, which was to give voters a chance to establish who would be candidates in the general elections, rather than party bosses. But he used his loyal supporters, and a good 30 to 40% in most parts of the country that really just follow him very, very carefully and consistently. And he had 290 endorsements. Again, this is U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, governors, secretaries of state, state legislative races, etc. And 290 victories he had of primaries where he supported somebody in the primary, endorsed them, and then they won actually. And 213 of these are kind of not really all that consequential because they were incumbents or they were not competitive races. So his endorsement was not really something that swung it one way or another. Nonetheless, he won 60 competitive and only lost 17 competitive races in terms of his endorsements. So he's a force to be reckoned with. And if you are a Republican wanting to run for office, having his endorsement generally is a positive, although the results of the general election indicate that not always. And like in Wisconsin, Michael's got Trump's endorsement, but nonetheless lost Evers. On the other hand, Ron Johnson also was endorsed by Trump. And there was a whole messy endorsement, non-endorsement with Robin Vos. So even when Trump does not prevail, he's a force, and he's visible, and somebody's got to be reckoned with. In general, he does have this core of support, people who are going to pay attention to what he's saying. But because of the record, the disappointment of there was no red wave, there are more and more people within the Republican Party who are basically saying, well, this may be risky because he may come after me, but I think we ought to be moving on, and we ought to think of other candidates. And there are, of course, some people who are Republicans, and they're prominent, they're visible, and they clearly would love to be in the White House. So they're gathering support. One of the issues that's going on right now is they're gathering support by gathering people who will fund them. That's always a kind of a primary that occurs before the primary where you start voting, is who can get the most support in terms of donors. And there are implications for the Democrats in terms of Trump winning or losing. If he does become, for example, the 2024 nominee for the Republicans, probably a lot of Democrats are going to say, well, that's not a bad thing. He lost by 7 million votes in 2020. Let's do it again. But it's also, there's an agenda that gets set, a kind of general tone to political competition that is set by his presence. Today, he has scheduled a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, and he's hinted that at the press conference, he will announce his candidacy for 2024. It's not being met with unanimous enthusiasm, but within the Republican Party, but clearly there are some people who are thinking, well, this is a good thing. So stay tuned. Let me just point to a number of general lessons from the past elections that we just had a week ago. One is brand loyalty. Clearly, most people, not everybody, but most people are Republicans, and they're going to vote for a Republican. Doesn't make any difference who the candidates or what the issues are. Likewise, there's some people who are loyal to the Democratic Party. They're going to vote for Democratic candidates, no matter what the issues, no matter what the charges back and forth. And that brand loyalty is very, very important. If you want to be a candidate, you want to run for office and win, having those supporters, just because of the party that you're in, is a good place to start. And then you can start building based on that. And depending on where you are geographically, it may be that indeed just getting that brand behind your name as a candidate is all you need. And that's why the primaries become very important. If we take a look at the campaigns, the campaigning that we had in this election followed a very common sort of pattern, particularly with the U.S. Senate campaign. That was very important, where not that many people knew who Mandela Barnes was in January of this year. And that gave the supporters of Ron Johnson an opportunity to define Mandela Barnes. And that's exactly what they did. And they did not define him in a way that was very positive. There was some racial connotations. They defined him as somebody who was irresponsible and crime, etc. And that stuck. In that, I think it's clear, hurt Mandela Barnes. He tried very hard to define himself as a good old Joe, as a member of the working class, somebody who liked peanut butter and jam sandwiches, that kind of thing. But that just, it was not very effective, obviously, and it just didn't work. Likewise, defining issues becomes important. What is it that you're going to try and get people mobilized for? And again, who turns out is very important. If you can get people all excited because their reproductive rights, because of inflation, those kinds of crime, those are issues that you appeal to certain kind of people, not always in terms of who they're going to vote for, but whether or not they're going to vote. And that becomes important. Money, holy cow. $16.7 billion spent in the 2022 elections. That's incredible. I think that's obscene. That's unconscionable. Ask me how I really feel about that. Does it have, and it's interesting because one question is, does it have an effect on the election? There's a concept that I learned in Economics 101 about point of diminishing returns, where you spend in a particular way or for a particular item, and your level of satisfaction, your level of return after a certain point is zero. You've gotten what you want and that's it. Well, I think the same thing is true of campaigning. And I've got a lot of former students who are in this multi-billion-dollar industry of running campaigns. And what they do is they play on the uncertainty, the nervousness of candidates, and they say, well, you need to spend a little bit more. And so the candidate goes out and raises a little bit more money and spends it, even if he's already or she's already been defined. People have pretty much decided whether they're going to vote and how they're going to vote. And so the money for another TV ad really isn't going to have any effect on any voter. Does it have an effect on governance? That's another issue. And I think the answer is yes. People do become beholden to their donors, particularly their major donors. And we've got some major donors in Wisconsin elections. The Uhlines and Diane Hendricks spend the most money. And it's quite clear that they focus on certain candidates. And if you're one of those candidates, you're going to know where that money came from and how you, and that you really do owe your success, at least in large part, to that. And that's not healthy. The other thing I sort of point out is the polls. Polls were pretty much on, pretty much right. Most of the polls indicated a close election, and in most cases they were close elections. It weren't, the idea of the red wave was really more, oh, it's historical. This is what happens from time to time. And indeed, when in the 2010 midterm elections, when President Obama was in office, 63 seats in the House of Representatives changed from Democrat to Republican. When Bill Clinton in 1994 was president, 54 seats changed from Democrat to Republican. So, there is something behind the history pattern, and history was the major reason why people said there was a red wave. It wasn't the polls so much. The polls didn't have that kind of evidence. It was more they were going to be close. And for the most part, they were close. So I'm going to stop, and I'll stop the sharing here. Okay. Oh, we've got, do we have anything in the chat?
I don't think there's anything in the chat right now, but that was great, Dennis. Thank you.
Sure.
I got a couple of questions. The future of the Republican Party, given what happened, what's the future of the Republican Party in your opinion? Obviously, you can't say, but
yeah, I think the Republicans are going to be going through a lot of conflict, internal conflict. The only reason why they wouldn't, or well, that conflict will be toned down if Donald Trump says it's been a good run, thanks, but I'm going to retire. That very few people are expecting that, and we'll find out by the end of today whether or not that's likely to happen. He right now has been identified as somebody who's responsible for the red wave not occurring, and there's some evidence to that. There's a lot of evidence that people voted against candidates that he endorsed, and that meant that the Democrats picked up that kind of support. And so I think there's something to that. I think that and that's sort of the Republican Party in terms of the electoral process. The other way of looking at this is the election, the nature of the Republican Party and how they're going to fare as we deal with governance. Obviously in the Senate, the Republicans are in the minority. Same thing as it's been the last couple of years. But in the House, I think it's worth our paying attention to what's going on there. It's already clear Republicans who've been elected to the House have said, Kevin McCarthy, we know that you want to be Speaker, but we don't want you to be Speaker for one reason or another. The Republican caucus in the House has had a particular segment of people who are much more to the right than the rest of the caucus. And one of the things, particularly the Republicans are not going to have a big majority. It's going to have a very slim majority. And so Kevin McCarthy is going to find out what the Democrats in the states in the U.S. Senate have been going through. He's going to have all sorts of Joe Manchins who are going to basically say, unless you do this or you do that, we're not going to support you for Speaker.
Sure. Okay.
And that's really, they're going to have a major effect on what goes on.
So thanks. Is there any room for a third party ever? Do you think that will the Republican Party ever split? Probably not.
Probably not. But having said that, we have had third parties emerge and become a force in our history and in our lifetime. They haven't had the success that historically they did, like a century or so ago. And in part, that's because of a lot of the state election laws and how you can get on the ballot and how ballots are structured, where you've got to meet certain kinds of thresholds to get your party on the ballot.
Okay.
And if you can't get your party on the ballot, you're really disadvantaged.
Sure.
So it would take a lot of changes. It would take a real revolution of sorts before we actually see
Sure.
a third party becoming very viable.
So there's some questions here. I mean, quite a few actually. How could we get more people to vote in Milwaukee? Is it due to not enough polling places, or is it just they're not showing up?
Yeah, they're not showing up. I think it's the idea of polling places. No, that's not really the issue. The county, which runs the election, has been almost as eager as Dane County has been to make sure that there are opportunities for people to vote. Now, the other thing that we all have to remember is that more and more people are voting absentee, and that includes people in Milwaukee. And if you are in the legislature and you want to see a lower voter turnout, particularly among populations of low income or minority populations, one of the things you're going to do is make it more and more difficult to vote absentee. And I think that's a factor. But I think that there's been a real challenge to get voters to actually go out and vote. African American and Latino voters in Milwaukee in particular always has been a big issue. I don't think that it's structural obstacles. It's more that they in the studies that we've done, they don't think that their votes really matter. They don't feel like they're as much a part of society, that they have much of a stake in society the same way that a lot of white people do.
Okay. There's another question. Do you think Joe Manchin would rather Warnock lose in Georgia?
Well, I think that Joe Manchin probably would like to have Herschel Walker as a colleague. He certainly has been able to exercise an incredible amount of power. And there's Kristen Sinema of Arizona as well. In any case where you've got a small minority, I mean, you can imagine, Marjorie Taylor Greene and, people like that. And there are several people like her that they could get together. I mean, that's what's happened with the Republican members of the House of Representatives. And they've successfully gotten rid of Paul Ryan and two speakers before him. And I think that's what they have in mind. That's what they're reminding Kevin McCarthy about.
Okay. This is kind of interesting. What is the RNC likely to adopt a more competitive primary process over time? Or
well, the RNC is not in charge of primaries. Those are states.
I think this is more. I believe this is probably more in terms of. I believe. I'm not sure. More for their own internal. Right. Who they're going to put on a ticket. I think.
Okay.
I believe
sure.
That's the question.
Yeah. Well, clearly the RNC is now dominated by Trump supporters, and typically a president does have, whether it's Republican or Democrat, a president does have an opportunity to influence the composition of the national committee of the party. And the party does play a role in terms of the convention, rules of the convention, the competitive process that's used at the convention, the Republican Party and the Democratic National Committee as well. They raise a lot of money and they spend money in a way that tries to get candidates that they favor supported. Trump, by the way, with his endorsement and in his way of trying to control the primary process, used his name, not his money. He spent nickels and dimes. So it wasn't so much the money, but it was more his name. And but the national committees, Republican and Democrat, do play a role, like I say, at the convention, and they also play a role in terms of raising money.
Another question, is there any current efforts to change how we do voting districts? How they're done in Wisconsin? I assume there is.
Yeah, but it's the frustration is that we don't really have an option. We don't have a statewide referenda other than an advisory. There have been several advisory referenda on whether or not we ought to have a nonpartisan or bipartisan process for drawing districts, or a process that's like Iowa's, where you have the professional staff of the legislature draw the boundaries rather than the legislators themselves. So there are options, but the legislature has not shown any interest in doing it. We don't have an option at the, in terms of like Michigan, they did it by referenda, and we don't have a referenda, not a binding referendum. We only have advisory. So the only way that you can really envision it, other than kind of massive brain surgery and legislators, would be through demographics, and having more people in small towns and rural areas who are inclined to be Democrats, support the Democratic Party, kind of whittle away. But that's not happening. And typically when a district or geographic part of the state starts to change in a way where there's a suspicion that it might become more competitive, the gerrymandering kind of nullifies that. That's what happened in southwestern Wisconsin.
Okay. We're actually at time here. There's a couple more questions here if you got some that you want to look at, but otherwise, sure. I think we're at time. So
yeah, I'm happy to go over a little bit.
Okay. Do you want to look at these yourself, or do you want me to? I don't mind.
You're doing a great job.
Any thoughts on making voting mandatory? I'm assuming not, but paying a fine if it's not, if you don't.
Yeah.
I don't see that.
Yeah, I mean, there are some countries where voting is mandatory. In Singapore, if you miss 2 elections, you lose your citizenship. So yeah, there are some countries that make it mandatory, but I don't know of any serious effort in the United States to do that.
You think there's ever any hope of passing campaign finance reform at all? I mean,
well, it was passed. I mean, that's what Russ Feingold and John McCain were able to accomplish. But in order for campaign finance reform to really take hold, we need to have a change in the U.S. Supreme Court, because they say, oh, no, you can't do that. Money is speech. And that's, so therefore that's First Amendment. A lot of legal scholars as well as policy people would disagree with that. But as long as the Supreme Court says, no, money is the same thing as speech, and therefore it's protected by the First Amendment, we won't have campaign finance reform.
Okay.
We can have it at the state level. And actually Arizona had a great campaign finance situation. The state of Maine did too. And they, to some extent, still have it, but people have gone to the Supreme Court and said, no, what they've got in Arizona, what they've got in Maine is not legal. And so the U.S. Supreme Court has taken out the campaign finance at the state level as well.
Okay. I think that hits most of them. So
okay.
Thank you.
So we can all go out and make snow angels, huh?
It is a little snowy out.
Yeah.
I wasn't so happy to see that this morning. I was going to go out and rake today, but that didn't happen. So
no, get your shovel instead. So again, next week, which will be our last one,
I didn't
last
know
session.
I didn't know I was on this, Dennis. I was gonna take my RV south, but it's like I could.
Oh, really?
probably-
Oh,
yeah, I thought, but I can put something together. So
okay, that would be great. I think we would all appreciate that. And then Bob Lavinia, as I mentioned, is going to talk about public sector employment issues.
sounds good. Well,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks, Kurt.